Okay, for this week's readings, you've looked at music. You looked at some of the effects of obscenity in music, the long-standing effects of violence, sexual imagery, etc. Looking both at music, music video. In addition to this week's readings and doing this week's quiz, you're also going to need to start working on your first critical analysis, where you'll be doing a in-depth look at a particular song. I've already put the songs out via email to you. You'll choose one of the songs. You will do a Miller test analysis of the song, looking at whether it's obscene based on does it appeal to the period interest, is it patently offensive, does it have redeeming value. Then you also need to look at some of the ways that you could fix the song if you do find that it's offensive. Then how could it be so that it's played on the radio? What different categories could go into it, backmasking, etc., in order to make it radio friendly. So you'll be looking at that, and so as you're going through these PowerPoints, kind of keep that in mind that you're going to be doing a Miller test for obscenity, but also look at the long-range effects of the particular song. Does it have violent imagery, sexual imagery, what makes the song obscene, etc. And so let's look at some of the issues here. Why has music been problematic with obscenity issues? From time immemorial, we've been looking at some issues, and then moving into always the present age, whatever that may be. There's always been the sense that music could be unsettling. So some of the issues that we've seen dating from the 1700s that have been published about different musical works is that it could cause moral panic, the effects of media on people, especially in modern day. We think of the rise in delinquency, rise in criminal activities, that constant barragement of sexual imagery, obscene imagery, violent imagery in songs, and listeners listening to them again and again lead to permissive sexual attitudes. Well, if this singer does it, then it's okay. Some of the songs that deal explicitly with suicide, possibly young people who are not stable, or even older people who are not stable, it may kind of push them over the edge. And then there's also the question of just misinterpreting the lyrics. You may think a song is about one thing when it turns out to be something, or vice versa, that the song is meant to be really obscene, and somehow that meaning is missed by the general population. So we'll be kind of looking at all of these issues this week. Notice that this quote goes back to Plato. So ancient Rome and Greece was looking at these issues. Specifically, Plato in ancient Greece was saying, shall we then thus lightly suffer our children to listen to any chance stories fashioned by any chance teachers, and so take into their minds opinions for the most part contrary to those that we shall think is desirable for them to hold when they are grown up? So even back then, there was this idea that people are going to pay attention to what others tell them. And the fact that you have musicians, singers, politicians, public figures today who start putting their opinion out there, some people will take that as a moral authority. And that's where this first issue comes into play, is that if we have people who are looking up to their singers and they're hearing this music that is ostensibly obscene, then that can affect them. In other words, if it's okay for Eminem to say these words, then it should be fine for me. Or if it's okay for divinals to talk about masturbation, then this is okay, whereas some groups want to say, put limits on different sexual activity, etc. So as far back as we can go in human history, there have been issues of who's going to have the moral authority to dictate what is obscene or not. I give you a couple of examples here of what has been banned in the past, or what has been really had a second look, because most people think classical music, how could that be offensive or obscene? Opera, the opera Madame Butterfly has been banned in many places and seen as obscene for content. Originally, when ragtime and jazz was the new art form, it was banned in its very early years, was not played on radios. It was seen as subversive. It was seen as glorifying sexual practices, inappropriate sexual practices, sexual promiscuity. And then there was also, especially with jazz and ragtime, a racial element built in, that since it was music of African Americans, then there was an issue of that as well, because this came out in the early 1900s. And then we even looked to something like 1953, 6 counties in South Carolina banned jukeboxes if it could be heard from a church. So going back to some of the things we've been talking about since the beginning of this semester, that oftentimes what is deemed to be obscene is something that's going to have a moral impact on family, church, country. So we keep kind of going back to that. So the issue of church here, if people in church could hear inappropriate music, then we didn't want that. Ragtime, jazz, if people were starting to hear new ways of thinking, new sexual practices, being exposed to racial equality, etc., then that's going to have an issue with country and family, and it's taking the moral authority away from the family to dictate what the children believe. So that was an issue as well.